Well, thanks. It's an honor to be here and talk about this topic. It's certainly one that wherever you live in this province or this country faces us squarely right now. One of the things, before I start, that I want to support here is that we're going to lay out a path forward with a new Forest Act and a new approach. But that's really a catalyst for a bigger change, and that's changing our ways of thinking about forests and our relationship with forests. So I encourage you to, as we work through this discussion about forests and forestry and forest law and policy, to keep that in mind. Okay, is that better? Yeah, that's better. All right. So I'm going to talk about forests for biodiversity and ecosystem health versus timber exploitation. How's okay? I may need a robot to do this. So the real problem stems from how we do forestry, and that's 99% clear-cut tree plantations. For me, forests all start with water, and water starts with drops. The power of forests to heal us and maintain themselves starts with capturing water droplets. If we think about ecosystems as a living fabric woven together by water, forest integrity depends upon protecting the living fabric of these forests. If you look at this spider's web with dewdrops on it, it forms a really good example of, or a comparison with forests. If you think about taking out one of these minor webs, that fabric stays together and the water stays together. But the more of those cross webs and main webs that come out, the more danger there is for the whole system to collapse. And what we've been doing is busily pecking away at those individual strands of that web. And now, in many places, including the landscapes around here, we're faced with a choice of, if we take out any more of those critical webs, we lose the whole system. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a quick review about intact primary forests. Michelle did a great job of putting all that information together, and I just want to kind of emphasize a few important points. The natural character of these systems is superior in many ways to modified forests or tree plantations. They're the best at water conservation, back to those drops that we need to make the whole system work. They collect carbon and store it better than any other forest phase. In fact, rivaling most ecosystems of any type. And they have the highest levels of biological diversity. So that's a good formula of why we want to take care of and protect these forests. So I'm going to go back to that water droplet because it's tied in very directly to how primary forests work and why they're so important. So if you think about that water coming out of the sky as snow or rain, the first thing that happens is interception. Then if you have big crowns, like you do in intact natural forests, particularly big old-growth forests, they gather those droplets together and store them. An interesting point, though, is that they move that water around. Somewhere around 40 to 60% of the water that's captured in the crowns of these big old trees is evaporated, or in the case of snow, sublimated, going directly from solid to gas, and moved across the landscape. So the forests where we are here are dependent upon the coastal rainforests that leapfrog that water to the interior, and our forests here leapfrog it eventually across the Rocky Mountains into the prairies. So there's good scientific evidence now that drought that occurs on the prairies is due to interruption of that interception and movement. The other thing that's really important to know about that interception and movement is that where it's intercepted, and that interception doesn't occur to move it, it builds up more water in the place that formerly leapfrogged it. So on the coast, that means you get 40 to 50% more water in those forest ecosystems after they've been logged and converted into tree plantations, which results in flooding. And if you talk about here, you accumulate more snowpack in the winter, which translates into flooding in the interior areas as well. And because there's no forest to hold that snowpack into the summer and fall, you also end up with drought. So both flooding and drought are a result of the failure to move that water in the right way. So I've covered really the idea of releasing that water, but I'll add one thing. With climate change, we're faced with a larger kind of problem that's going to make things warmer and drier. We need the crowns of trees in forests to collect, intercept, and hold that moisture, keep the humidity high to reduce the effects of climate change. And that results also the same process in dripping and feeds the tree crowns and lower plants. So we're not just talking about trees, but we're talking about whole forest ecosystems and how that drip effect and accumulation and movement effect of water works. Eventually, it gets to the soil and groundwater and finds its way into the streams, creeks, and rivers. This is an interesting bit of research here that surface runoff in undeveloped watersheds in the Pacific Northwest is less than 1% of the precipitation falling on the watershed. So that shows you that interception, gathering, collection, and how intact natural forests, primary forests, conserve and maintain whole ecosystems. This is just another picture to emphasize the importance of individual drops. The more leaves there are, in this case needles on a Douglas fir, the more water that's intercepted and stored. And so that's another argument for big tree crowns and maintaining intact old forests as a way of conserving water and mitigating the climate crisis. The other thing that I want to emphasize are fallen trees. Fallen trees are the source of decayed wood, which is where a huge amount of water is filtered and stored. Decayed wood holds something in the neighborhood of 20 times more water than a sandy loam soil, an equivalent volume. So if we clear cut and remove or or run over those fallen trees with a skidder, you lose that function. There's no question that those fallen trees, that decayed wood, are the foundation for future forests. So right away, when you understand that, you see the problem with repeated cycles of clearcuts and tree plantations. You're never replacing this vital structure that stores and filters water. Every watershed that functions well needs, depending on its size, needs millions or billions of tons of decayed wood. And that's not something we can go to the hardware store, buy and take out and spread around a site after we're done logging it. That takes hundreds of years to replace that. So another aspect of these forests that isn't often talked about a lot is the fungi, or it's a keystone species, and what we find more and more is the diversity of fungi in the soil is much higher in old growth forests or in late successional forests, primary forests. So the next thing to think about with primary forests are intact riparian ecosystems. That riparian ecosystems are like a voltage regulator between the forest and water or hydrology in these ecosystems. The intact riparian ecosystems, oops, wrong button, regulate the movement of water and energy into that water course. That's why they're voltage regulators. And so if you have intact riparian ecosystems with big old trees in them, and you have intact upland forests, even when you get a lot of water moving in that system, because these riparian ecosystems have a very high density of vegetation and big old trees, they regulate the energy moving into that river and prevent things like floods and drought. So it's another really important aspect of how primary forests, particularly old growth forests, function. So from water drops, as you can see in the top left-hand corner there, to year-round streams, healthy watersheds require the composition, structure, and function of intact primary forests. Water is life for all of us, and whether you're a fungi or an amphibian or a moose or us, and that ties us directly to intact old forests if we want to have a good, healthy environment. So one of the things that is particularly important in terms of maintaining watershed health are late summer and fall low flows. They're maintained by old growth forests, intact riparian ecosystems, both of which we've had a quick look at here. They're also maintained by shallow subsurface flows in soils. So some of that water that doesn't find its way into a water course also moves through the soil. And that subsurface flow is much better in intact primary forests than it is in tree plantations, for example. There's also a geological aspect to this, and that's that some groundwater is recharged from faults that are below the surface and recharged again by water falling into forests, and for that matter, other kinds of ecosystems, and filtering down to those faults. Wetlands and lakes are also important parts of maintaining that health. And in some forests, not so much around here, but to some degree in the wet areas here, you get atmospheric moisture that drips from the tree crowns. So if you have big old tree crowns here, you will have that fog drip effect at different times of the year, particularly when you in the fall and spring, and not so much in the winter because these are snow-dominated systems here. So I want to talk a little bit about an important thing that is related to how to manage or how to protect forests. Irrecoverable carbon is a term that has been put in place to describe the time to recapture carbon exceeds the time we have remaining before the worst effects of climate change happen. That term, irrecoverable carbon, is directly pointed at things like clearcuts and tree plantations. So if you clear cut an area, you end up with a carbon dead zone in terms of accumulating carbon for something in the order of 15 years. But even after that, to get back to the same level of carbon sequestration or capture and storage, in the ecosystems we're talking about around here, you're talking about 150 to 200 years. So you've created quite a carbon debt, and that's irrecoverable carbon. So every time you look at a clear cut, there's never in our lifetime going to be enough carbon capture and storage to recoup the losses that we created by that logging. So it's been documented but ignored, I might say, by the timber industry and most foresters, that timber harvesting, because of this irrecoverable carbon, is by far the largest source of greenhouse gases. People like Jim Pojar have studied this for decades, and that comes from a publication that he produced with the Sierra Club. So let's just take a look at the forests and how it works with carbon. I'm also going to talk a little bit about methane, because methane is an even more powerful, albeit a little shorter-lived greenhouse gas. So if we look at the standing forest there on the left, it has a major input of carbon dioxide and methane. Then if we go to the center slide, which represents a clear cut or a degraded forest, it's releasing carbon dioxide there. And it also is, like I mentioned earlier, a carbon dead zone for about 15 years. And eventually, you have a regenerating or regrowing forest that begins to capture carbon. But as I mentioned earlier, it won't get back to a normal level from an intact forest for hundreds of years. And the same thing is true with methane. You lose the input or capture of methane in a clear cut, and then have very slow recovery of that as the forest grows. So that slide is meant to kind of, as a summary, to say that removal of forests is a big problem for increasing greenhouse gases that will last in many cases for hundreds of years. So another thing to keep in mind, in forestry and in forest policy and legislation, we treat tree plantations as though they were forests. Tree plantations are no more forests than wheat fields are grasslands. They lack the diversity and the structure and function to manage water, control the climate to the point that climate moderation occurs, and there's a huge loss of species. We've talked a lot about the fact that they're sources of that irrecoverable carbon. They lack the crown mass to slow and redistribute, to intercept, store, and redistribute water. The homogeneous composition and structure reduces biological diversity. There's a real simple opportunity here for ecological restoration, and that means stop clear-cut, short rotation timber cropping. Part of why we're here today is to think about policies and laws that will do exactly that. And clear cuts, new tree plantations, second growth tree plantations. This is a kind of a summary from going back to some of the points we've made about water. The flood and risk and due to large-scale clear cutting and wildfires, forests serve as the most effective natural defense against a global escalating flood risk attributed to factors such as climate change. Now is the time for water and forest management policies to start being guided by the most up-to-date and defensible science. That's a quote from Jonas Alila, who is a forest hydrologist at UBC in the forestry department. His research has quite simply blown the lid off the idea that clear cuts and tree plantations are compatible with avoiding floods and drought. So compared with intact primary forest, tree plantations are the most flammable too. So that's another thing to add to that risk of water or risk to water is the fact that those interlocking crowns of trees growing closely together, as opposed to the multi-layered canopies of old primary forests, are like a whole bunch of towers of gasoline touching each other. And so if you have a fire, that fire spreads very rapidly in those systems. Another opportunity which is related to protecting primary forests that aren't yet at an old phase is to let those natural forests grow. Let them conserve water, mitigate, and adapt to climate change and protect biodiversity. So there's a fair amount of primary forests that fall in that category, that are areas that have had natural disturbances from things as varied as wind and snow to insects like the mountain pine beetle and fire. Really important to identify those and not treat them as though they're some kind of waste, which has led to a really poorly designed and very destructive to ecologically salvage logging program. The current policies literally almost pay timber companies to log those areas, which is exactly the wrong thing to do. So this is a quote here from Norm Christensen and Jerry Franklin, who have studied these forests for for decades and decades. And I think it's interesting, the common sense here. Nature knows what it's doing, and human intervention tends to make matters worse, not better. If we can let our forests be, we will reap many benefits, including increased biological diversity, water conservation, and recreation, and fewer wildfires. That comes from two people who together probably have well over 100 years of experience in working with forests all over the Northwest. And then we can enter into the whole issue of herbicides. So herbicide spraying, or the perceived need for herbicide spraying, to me ignores a couple of things. After you've done something as radical to a forest like a clear cut, it's going to need a period to reestablish the composition and structure. And it does that by a whole series of different plants and plant communities through time, which also bring along with them animal communities through time. But forestry mistakenly thinks that if we can get rid of those successional plants, which are actually healing the site, they're actually putting it back together in a way that it will develop into an intact forest again. But forestry is impatient. It doesn't want to wait. We know from good research that if you let that natural succession take place, that over time, the growth rate of the conifers that the timber companies want will actually be better than if you try to remove that vegetation. And this is a picture of herbicide spraying, and it's, as I've described, it's really an unnecessary treatment. It threatens water, and removes the benefits of those successional processes. Plants, animals, carbon sequestration, and storage are all harmed by that approach. So if there is a real concern, which I think there's very few places where that occurs, then don't use herbicides that further pollute water and poison soil, but use partial cut forestry. If you use partial cut forestry, you will avoid a lot of the successional, or minimize the successional process that is perceived to be damaging to timber production. So this is a picture of a natural regeneration in a clear cut that it was or is a biologically rich site. These slides are thanks to Jim Steidel, who I appreciate the chance to use them. So this is before spraying with an herbicide. That's after spraying with a herbicide. So the picture kind of tells it all in terms of the damage of what's occurred there. So I want to just summarize some of what I've been talking about here in terms of forestry's effects on water and watersheds, because those are the big picture issues that we need to change. Removal of multi-layered forest canopies means loss of water interception and storage, leads to floods and drought, which we've talked about here. Loss of decayed fallen trees means a loss of water filtration and storage, which is a huge part of how watersheds function. And along with that, we lose those natural voltage regulators. The loss of intact riparian ecosystems results in increased turbidity and loss of important biodiversity. Concentration of water along things like skid roads and haul roads that dump water into ditches and concentrate it through culverts leads to erosion and landslides, with again corresponding degradation of soil and water. Soil stability or instability results as the roots of stumps decay. When an area is logged, it will take several decades over time for the roots of those stumps to decay. But as those roots have grown, they have cemented the sides of the right next to them in the soil, so that it makes those, where those roots were after they've decayed, not permeable to water. They're like pipes, and that concentrates water on a slope and results in both landslides and other forms of erosion. And every time we practice forestry the way we do it right now, we're exacerbating climate change, because we're removing that carbon storage system, the collection of methane. We're removing water storage and filtration from the system. And a lot of that is due to that irrecoverable carbon that we've talked about. And finally, pesticides. They threaten water, the successional processes that rebuild forests after a disturbance, as well as human health and plants and animals that use those sites. And the other climate change related issue that we're all dealing with virtually everywhere now is many more wildfires. Well, let's stop creating tree plantations and second growth forests that are the most flammable form of forests. So I've spent a little time sort of rehashing some of the things that Michelle mentioned about the importance of primary forests, and also discussed what's some of the degradation and problems created by forestry the way it's done now. Now I want to turn to a different way of looking at forests. Back to that, what I mentioned earlier about changing our ways of thinking. So we can either use anthropocentric or human-centered values to drive our forests, or we can look at kincentric, the fact that we're all related, and by all related I mean all beings, all aspects of ecosystem, or earth-centric values. That's a clear choice for us, and we can design policies and approaches to forests that follow either of those. Right now, they're clearly in the anthropocentric category. Buckminster Fuller has a wonderful quote about what I'm talking about here. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. I think that's what we're all here to do really today. So I have the benefit of studying in some of the best libraries in BC, and in my deliberations in those libraries, I've come up with a different approach. What I call a nature-directed path to a new relationship with forests. It's a regenerative process. It is respectful of the system. It's gratitude-filled, and it's a reciprocal relationship with nature. Those elements are things, those are places we need to start when we think about what to do to be a better part of the forest ecosystems we inhabit. If we can bring those things together, that leads to nature-directed stewardship, which I'll define a little more for you. This is a quote from Jeanette Armstrong that really fits with this to me. Ethical conduct within nature is based on reciprocity. there's not much reciprocity that occurs with forestry the way it's done in this province. So let me talk about some of the important principles of nature-directed stewardship. It starts with focusing first on what to protect, then on what to use. What to protect are fully functioning ecosystems, from the scale of this darning needle on a bluebell to whole watersheds. So it's a scale-dependent approach to our relationship with forests, and it has to start with little things and extend to the biggest things. There is another reminder of us about reciprocity here from Robin Wall Kimmerer. We inhabit a landscape of gifts peopled by non-human relatives, the sovereign beings who sustain us. Another humble way to see ecosystems and at the same time to practice reciprocity. The approach to nature-directed plans starts with recognizing a hierarchy. And that hierarchy is said very simply: economies are part of cultures, cultures are part of ecosystems. So if you play that back, if you take care of the ecosystem, then you always have healthy cultures. Witness the millennia of indigenous people across the world who maintained, protected the ecosystem and always had healthy cultures because of that. And economies are simply a part of that culture. All an economy is people relating to people, providing the goods and services they need. Today's world has kind of turned that hierarchy upside down. It wants the economy to be the important thing. And that's why we're busily destroying forests and other ecosystems around the planet. We can change that. This is a quote from Dennis Martinez, who's sadly not with us anymore, but a person I had the good fortune to work with for several decades, practicing an approach that we call ecocultural restoration. But he defined this term, kincentricity, and this is just a small quote from a paper he wrote about it. And it's indigenous land care practices that entail reciprocal relationships laid out in original compacts between animals and humans. A way of life that includes relating respectfully to all life as kin and to the earth as a nurturing mother. With an emphasis there are no natural resources when those beings are your kin who must be approached with respect before harvesting. Another part of the philosophical and the changing our ways of thinking that's necessary to change our relationship with forests. Nature-directed stewardship sees forests as identities to be respected, not objects to be dominated. Another key starting point. And in order to achieve that, one of the priorities is to identify ecological limits. Think about ecological limits as a practical application of the precautionary principle. It's like a flashing yellow light out there saying, if you trespass here, if you go past this point, you're going to degrade the ecosystem into what is oftentimes an irrecoverable kind of damage. Some examples of ecological limits include shallow soils, very dry or very wet sites at both extremes, steep, broken, unstable slopes, snow-dominated ecosystems that get heavy snow loads, unique and rare habitat that's naturally unique. I'm not talking here just about habitat that's been threatened by us, But in all ecosystems, there's naturally some parts of it that are very small composition in that ecosystem. But those systems don't work very well without those unique or naturally rare habitats, just like our heart isn't much of the volume of our body, but we don't work very well without it. That same analogy applies to ecosystems. Threatened and endangered species are the ones that we've created by our mismanagement of forests and other ecosystems. Riparian ecosystems get a big exclamation point here because of their regulation of water movement in the system, and that playing that role of a voltage regulator and keeping streams, lakes at moderate levels throughout a season. And old natural forests, which unfortunately are becoming increasingly rare, along with not only old natural forests, but just intact natural forests in general. So this is a key starting point or a key priority in nature-directed stewardship is networks of ecological reserves. As Michelle was giving her talk, I couldn't help but think about how this applied to a lot of the examples that she was talking about. That those networks of ecological reserves, and in many cases cultural reserves that are developed with the information and permission of indigenous nations, are done at multiple spatial scales, starting from as large a scale as large an area as possible, right down to individual patches. That's what multiple spatial scales looks like from an actual plan that I did for the Innu Nation in Nitassinan or Labrador, which they've given me permission to use. So you can see how in this diagram, you go from a very large area here that was something in the order of 7 million hectares down to an individual patch that was in the order of 20 hectares. And along the way, you create ecological reserves. You can see those in green here, and this blue was a big caribou reserve. It moves down from this big landscape down to a watershed issue. Here in this protected landscape network, which is a fairly fine network, all that pink means forested wetlands. And those forested wetlands were definitely off limits to any kind of forestry. And finally, when you get down to these small areas, you still need to understand how ecosystems are connected and related to each other. You need to respect those ecological limits that we're talking about. So further protection of ephemeral streams, wetlands, and then there was a little bit of cutting done here. This pattern here with the sort of regular stipples represents small little holes that were cut in the stand. This pattern over here represents removal of individual trees. So that's the kind of thinking that needs to be applied to any forest that we decide to practice forestry in. And you can start anywhere along the way. You don't have to have a 7 million hectare area. You can start right here at this little patch if you want to. But certainly starting here at the watershed level is not only the most common, but the most practical one to use. So let's go back to primary forests here for a minute. In these large landscapes and small landscapes, primary forests are protected, period. they're part of the protected landscape network. And where you practice forestry occurs at both the watershed scale and also at the site scale. So that ties in again with what Michelle was talking about. We protect primary forests, and then we can fit into secondary or restoration forests at the watershed and patch level. So let me kind of just reinforce what landscapes are. Landscapes are big watersheds or moderate-sized watersheds, and they hold the patches within them. So just like I'm holding this changer in my hand is a landscape, and this is a patch. So what I do to the landscape affects the patch. And interestingly enough, vice versa. You can think about what I do to the patch as also affecting the landscape because they're interconnected. So we want that structure that we created by multiple spatial scale ecological reserve networks, we want to maintain that composition, structure, and function through time. And you can see in this photograph, there's been a fire here. Okay, that was a natural disturbance. That's part of natural succession. That's part of the forest changing. And that forest changing is, interestingly enough, necessary to maintain biodiversity over time. For example, in boreal forests, in many, particularly in the wet boreal in eastern Canada, wildfire that burns forests there actually results in the rejuvenation of cladina lichen, which is a really important caribou food. So that's just one example of why it's important to maintain composition, structure, and function through time. And in case those words are a little strange to you, think about composition as the parts. Structure is how those parts are arranged. So if a tree is composition, then, and we talk about structure of a tree, it can be a small tree, medium-sized tree, sapling, old tree, snag, or dead tree, and fallen tree. So that's what we mean when we talk about structure. And function is just simply the processes of parts of the parts or the composition and structure working cooperatively. So these two things work together, the parts and how they're arranged, to result in the function. And that leads me to another really important point that we need to think about when it comes to the whole idea of nature-directed stewardship, or for that matter, any intervention in ecosystems. If you change or lose the composition and structure, you change or lose the function. So taking away big old trees, by now, from what we've been talking about here today, you realize that you lose a lot of important functions in the system. And you also realize, as you think very long, that it takes hundreds of years to replace those functions. So in relation to different kinds of climates and soils, in other words, big trees aren't all of equal size from a dry site to a moist, rich site. So keep that in mind. But this general relationship holds. Old is better, old and big is even better, and old, big, and complex is the best. So that means something that to tie back to primary forests, old growth or primary forests need to be seen as non-renewable resources. So not only do they have all these ecological functions, that support us, we need to realize that we don't know how to recreate them. And I'll say that again, we don't know how to recreate them. If climate change doesn't get them, trees, we may end up with tree plantations growing old trees, but there's no evidence that they will bring with them the biological diversity and the complexity that exists in those forests today. We don't understand that. We have barely touched that when it comes to science. So the other kind of point to emphasize is that we need to manage watersheds. And the three things we need to think about when we manage watersheds that are tied back to forests is water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. Every little watershed you can see in this picture in a boreal forest, whether it's this one here or this larger watershed here or the Athabasca River that you could see here, are all interconnected. And that means those ecological reserve networks need to be in place to make sure that those connections are maintained. So one of the ways to do that is to see timber, minerals, tourism, urban develop as byproducts, not as the focus for what we do, but as byproducts that may occur after we've ensured that we are going to protect the ecological integrity through time of those forests. This is just a quick series of maps which I won't dwell upon, but just to show you that we are making these kinds of plans. This is a map that shows the hydrological sensitivity of a small watershed in the West Kootenays. And from that, the community can decide if there are locations that timber management or other kinds of uses make sense, or if the watershed is too sensitive to do those things in and maintain that natural water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. This is an example of the same watershed, which weaves together ecological limits and riparian ecosystems into a protected network, a protected landscape network for that area. And it's interesting that the result here ends up with only a very small amount of area. The areas down here that are kind of crosshatched as places that would make sense to do any kind of timber extraction, even partial cut timber extraction, without damage to the watershed. So these plans operate on ecological timeframes. Generations of people live through those plans and adapt them as they get better information. This is quite antithetical to the fact that our society tends to operate on annual profit and losses. Even environmental groups are faced with that kind of economic reality sometimes. So this is another way where we need to practice reciprocity with nature and think in a more logical way. Think in a way that is more like an ecosystem, not like a corporation. Those timeframes need to encompass the lifetime of salmon here, the lifetime of this alder tree, and one of the people that I worked with for many years, who's no longer with us, Stan Rowe, who is kind of a premier ecologist in Canada, always reminded me the lifetime of the rocks and minerals too. So that's the kind of humility and reciprocity that needs to be provided. So increasingly though, we're dealing with degraded ecosystems, and more we have to deal with ecological restoration, which we don't really know that much about. That term rolls off our tongues really easily, and oftentimes I believe that occurs because it's a way to say, don't worry about this clearcut and tree plantation. If something goes wrong, we'll restore it. Well, I can tell you that that's BS, because a lot of the people that are saying that don't have a clue what that means, let alone actually trying to do it. So that means that the first priority of restoration is to stop making the mistakes that create the need for it. It's kind of like the duh moment, you know? I mean, why not just take that simple action rather than continuing to degrade ecosystems? Because all restoration means really is assisting natural processes to reestablish the natural composition, structure, and function. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this slide, we don't really know how to do that. It's not a matter of going down to your local nursery and scooping up some soil and taking it back out there and putting it on the site. No, that doesn't work. It takes decades and in most cases centuries. So let me show you quickly here a couple of examples. This is a project on Galliano Island, which is in the Salish Sea and down between Vancouver and Vancouver Island. And these were very rich Douglas fir sites. There we practiced and it's still working on trying to restore an old growth forest, which, like I said earlier, we don't really know how to do. But what we're trying to do is reestablish the natural composition and structure, which means moving some of these big old trees that were all piled up into brush piles, spreading them back out on the site, trying to reestablish that water storage and filtration system. And at the same time, it's reestablishing biodiversity. This is a picture of Shawnigan Lake, where we're practicing another form of nature-directed stewardship to restore water quality at quantity and timing of flow. You can see the network there at different scales. This focuses even closer in a Shawnigan Lake patch to show you that this was an area that was part of a woodlot. Every one of those green dots on there are full cycle trees that will be left there to grow old and die and rebuild the composition and structure of that system through time. So I just want to kind of leave us with a few thoughts. The Dalai Lama says it all for me. If humankind continues to approach its problems from the perspective of temporary expediency, future generations will face tremendous difficulties. I think we're already there, really. And the new Forest Act that we're here to talk about, sorry for the technical glitch here, but that's a nice summary of it. Nature-directed stewardship is enshrined in law. That's administered by a publicly accountable agency, unlike the current Forest and Range Practices Act that turns the responsibility over to timber companies and their consultants. And it's then run through a community forest board that provides protection for community water supplies, diverse community-based economies. They imply employment for forest protection. And there was a question asked earlier about where does it come from if employment come from if we don't cut as many trees. Well, there's a huge amount of forest restoration to be done out there. We subsidize the current timber industry to the tune of about $365 million a year. Why not take that same money and put it into restoration and designing of nature-directed stewardship plans? So these plans need a forest zonation system, and that ties in with protection of primary forests. They get full protection. Restoration forests, timber extraction is constrained by the needs for restoration, and secondary forests require partial cutting with full cycle trees and the practice of nature-directed stewardship. Those full cycle trees look something like this. You can see the fact that there are trees of all ages and sizes scattered through there, including fallen trees. So those are the full cycle trees up there and the fallen trees. So I'll end where we started with water droplets. I'm going to just let you read this because Harold Johnson, who is unfortunately passed on, but I had the good fortune to work with Harold in boreal forests in northern Saskatchewan for quite a while. And I asked him if he would write something to put on the back of a book that I wrote, and this is what he wrote. And when I read it, I said to Harold, I'm not going to put that on the back of the book. I'm going to start the book with this, because I think that this is really a nice synopsis of the humility with which we need to approach forests. So we're part of nature. We need to think like the intact ecosystems that we've been talking about, and we need to stop these foolish kinds of ideas blocking our way. And I'll finish with a nice shot of the Upper Fraser watershed. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Herb. You've been at it for a few years. Lots of people in this room have been at it for quite a number of years. My most optimistic time with regards to shifting in what was going on with the forest was back in the days of the early 80s. You gave presentations to the Caribou Horse Loggers Association for us. And when I saw loggers, fellow buncher operators and mill workers walk away from those corporate captured structures and joining the Caribou Horse Loggers Association, that was a very, very optimistic time for me in terms of seeing the kind of movement that individual people were making and shifting in their lives. We've gone through different cycles in terms of the awareness around the need for change. I'm feeling quite optimistic about now, even though we have less options in terms of what's left. But the kind of things that we're talking about in terms of eliminating industrial activity in primary forests are going to require a transition strategy that's unprecedented in terms of keeping and having our communities in all of these forest-dependent areas continue and thrive. So I'm wondering about, and the big thing that has kept all of these different movements from achieving success is that level of corporate capture that has strangled the political movement. I'm glad to see that there's 3 Green Party candidates, Gwen, Randy, myself, in this upcoming provincial election here. But I think I estimate about a little under 10% of the crowd here today, so that's a little bit optimistic for me. But I'm wondering about your feeling, all the different eras that you've been through, whether and what is it going to take to get us to eliminating and instructing against that corporate capture?
Well, I think what it's going to take is for everybody here who agrees with what we've been talking about to go spread that word to other people. It's not going to. It's one of the things that's a reality in the world we live in today is that we're governed by corporations, not by people, and that we need to change that. And the only way we can change that is through us. We're the ones that have to change that. And I think what's happened here today is a really good step in that direction. And I think that the material that Jennifer has put together, I would encourage you to take a look at that because there's a really good amount of material there that you can take to politicians, to municipal and local governments, and all the way up to provincial and federal governments to promote these kinds of changes. But it's not going to happen with all due respect to the Green Party. It's not going to happen by electing different political parties. It's going to happen by changing our ways of thinking, and that happens through people relating to people and building that kind of power. Because once you can build that amount of social power, then any of the political parties will grab a hold of it because they realize that they have to do that if they want to be elected and stay elected.
I got a question here. Good afternoon, Herb. Finally, it's so nice to see you. I'm a practicing forester for the last 23 years. I have worked with both private and government sector in forestry. I idealize you and read your books, a lot of publication, and I always wanted to meet you, and here you are. So thank you so much for coming out here, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to ask you if you could share your feeling about, your perception about the current, the government initiative to change, fire regulation, Forest and Range Practices Act, indicating that there will be some changes to silviculture reforestation practices, meaning that basically, not strictly timber production focused, but maybe diversify into non-timber production based, management, silviculture management. And also, changing from previous, forest stewardship plan to FLP, forest landscape planning, to basically have more inclusion of, different voices, indigenous, stakeholder, object. Just curious, what you're thinking about, these proposed changes.
Well, if I understood the question correctly, it's focused on the new forest landscape planning approach. I guess perhaps I bring some of the answer to that from a little bit of a cynical point of view, and that's that when you look at the structure of forest landscape planning, the way the province has now put it in place, the licensees or the timber corporations still kind of control what will happen there. They're now required by law to listen to indigenous nations and rural communities and individuals, but they're not required by law to incorporate that. So it feels a little bit to me like smoke and mirrors, and I think that if they really want to have landscape level planning that's effective and meets the needs of indigenous nations and rural people, rural communities, then they need to require nature-directed stewardship plans. And in that requirement, they need to include indigenous nations and rural people as part of the decision-making process in the plan itself. That's what real landscape level planning looks like.
Thank you.
Amazing. Okay, we have time for one more question, and then any other questions we'll save for the end of them.
Being a bit of a troublemaker, I actually have two questions. But before I ask those, I gotta admit to people here that I'm so old that I remember very distinctly the late 1960s when they had what they called the war in the woods, where people blockaded logging roads and tried to interfere with logging companies and that kind of stuff. Interestingly, it seems like that's still going on for the same reasons. At the time, the logging companies were very, very willing to go along with what people were asking. Because what people wanted was multi-use of the forest, not just logging. And they said, sure, that's great, we can go along with that, we'll log it, and after that you can do whatever you want with it. That seems to be still going on too. There's a bit of a view, and I think we had a question earlier that touched on that, which is without logging, or if we alter anything at all about the logging process, we're all going to die a terrible, horrible, agonizing death of economic suicide. Possibly in your grandfather's day that may have been accurate. But if you look at Statistics Canada and take a look at what part of BC's economy is from logging, you might be staggered at what you discover and how different that might be from your actual view of things. Most people believe that logging is a much, 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 much bigger part of our economy than it actually is today. It might have been back then. So to get to my two questions, we talked about culture and the culture that the forest represents and so on. We have quite a significant number of families that have had 3 and 4 generations of clear-cut, massive logging. The bigger, the better. That's a culture too. How do we incorporate that culture into the changes that we want to make? Because if we don't incorporate it, some people who are indebted to the bank for their next generation for equipment, we will have a significant number of people who have a vested interest in undermining what we are trying to accomplish. So how do we change that? And the second question is also, how do we change the view pushed by PR from various places that logging is the absolute economic backbone of the province, which it hasn't been for a long time now. But how do we change that? Because if we don't change both of those items, then all the stuff we're talking about here are really just cute stories that are going to do nothing. Because that's where we have to address the issue, I believe, but that is me. So how do we change those two issues?
Well, I think your questions have similar answers, really. I think the first thing we need to do is ensure that at all levels of education, that people, it's explained to people how forests function. And especially in this era of climate change, there is a growing urgency and a lot of angst amongst younger people. And I think if the information that we've been talking about here today isn't spread very far and wide, unfortunately. And that one of the things that I think could really help would be to get this kind of discussion and this kind of these kinds of facts into the public education system. The timber companies themselves are busily doing that. You can take forestry in high school, but it's not forestry like we're talking about here today. It's forestry that's destroying forests. And another thing that I think ties into the second question is to point out that the forestry, the employment from forestry, is less than 2% of the GDP of BC. And similarly, it employs only, I think, slightly less than 2% of the workforce. So their control over the ecosystems that sustain us is far disproportionate to their contribution to the economy and our culture. And that needs to be out there more. It seems to me like both indigenous and non-indigenous groups need to come together to build an education lobby that rivals what the timber industry is doing. Because individually, we don't have perhaps that political and social power, but collectively we do. And that's where I think the answer comes from.